April 29th, 1945. The war in Europe was almost over. German cities were collapsing. Hitler was days from death. Victory was no longer a question of if, only when. And yet, on the outskirts of Munich, a column of American infantry slowed to a halt beside a silent train. 39 freight cars, no movement, no guards, no sound. The men of the 45th Infantry Division had fought through Sicily, Anzio, southern France. They had seen artillery tear bodies apart. They had buried friends in foreign soil. They believed they understood war. They did not understand this. Before they reached the gates of Dachau, before a single shot was fired, before history would argue about what happened next, something inside those soldiers began to shift. Not because of battle, but because of what they were about to see. And once they saw it, there was no going back. By late April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. American forces were advancing rapidly through southern Germany. Towns surrendered without resistance. White flags appeared in windows. German soldiers deserted in plain clothes. The men of the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, were seasoned by then. They had landed in Sicily in 1943. They had fought through the mud and stone of Italy. They had climbed hills under machine gun fire at Anzio. They had pushed across France after the southern invasion. They were not naive boys. They were veterans. Their orders that morning were routine. Secure a complex near the town of Dachau, just northwest of Munich. Intelligence suggested it was a military installation, a depot, possibly a training facility. No one briefed them about a concentration camp. No one prepared them for starvation on an industrial scale. And no one mentioned the train. It sat on a side track just outside the perimeter fence, dark, closed, still. The first men approached cautiously, rifles ready. They expected resistance. What they encountered instead was silence and a smell that did not belong to war. The smell reached them first, not gunpowder, not smoke, not the metallic scent of fresh blood. This was older, thicker, sweet and sickening. A lieutenant climbed onto the coupling between two freight cars and slid the door open. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone swore under his breath. Inside were bodies, packed tightly, layered, men in striped uniforms, women, some so emaciated their bones pressed sharply against their skin. Many had died days before, some only hours earlier. The train had arrived from Buchenwald. It had been abandoned. Nearly 2,000 prisoners had been left inside those sealed cars, without food, without water. The living had lain among the dead. When the doors were finally opened, a few survivors still stirred weakly beneath the weight of the others. The soldiers of the 45th had seen death before. But death in battle has motion. It has noise. It has context. This was different. This was organized decay, industrial suffering. One private sat down in the gravel beside the track and removed his helmet. Another turned away and vomited. Others simply stared, not speaking, not moving. For a few long seconds, the war they thought they understood no longer made sense. This was not combat. This was not strategy. This was something deliberate. And as they walked past those open freight cars toward the gates of Dachau, something began to change. Not in their orders, not in their training, but in the space between what a soldier is taught and what a human being can bear to see. Beyond the railway siding stood the outer fence of Dachau. Watchtowers, barbed wire, concrete walls that had held more than prisoners. They had held silence. Inside were nearly 30,000 surviving inmates, starved, diseased, barely standing. The guards knew the war was lost. The camp's commandant had already fled. In his place was a young SS officer, Heinrich Wicker, 23 years old, clean uniform, polished boots. He stepped forward under a white flag. He did what soldiers are trained to do when defeat is inevitable. He surrendered. "I hand over the camp to the United States Army," he reportedly said. On paper, it was a formal act, an orderly transition of authority. But nothing about that morning felt orderly. American officers looked past Wicker, past the uniform, past the rehearsed composure, and toward the open train cars behind them, toward the smell still clinging to the air, toward the crematorium buildings visible beyond the yard. Inside the camp, prisoners had already begun pressing against the fences, shouting in broken English, "Americans!" Some collapsed from exhaustion before they could reach the gates. Others wept. The soldiers had been prepared for resistance. They had not been prepared to become witnesses. And in that space, between surrender and entry, discipline began to strain. The laws of war assumed two sides engaged in combat. Here, there were survivors, and there were men in SS uniforms who had guarded them. For a few moments, the American advance slowed. Orders were given, positions secured, weapons lowered. But beneath the surface, anger was spreading quietly. Not shouted, not theatrical, but controlled, contained, and dangerously close to breaking. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks understood immediately that something was wrong, not tactically, emotionally. He had commanded these men through Sicily and Italy. He knew their discipline. He knew their limits. But Dachau was not a battlefield. It was evidence. As units moved deeper into the camp, small groups of SS guards were being gathered. Some had thrown down their weapons. Some claimed they had been forced into service. Some insisted they were not responsible. They were herded toward a coalyard near a brick wall. Witnesses would later disagree on the exact sequence of events, but they agree on this. The tension snapped. A machine gun was set up, facing a line of surrendered guards. Some accounts say an officer gave a gesture. Others say a soldier acted without explicit orders. For a few seconds, perhaps 10, the gun fired. When it stopped, dozens of SS men lay on the ground, some dead, some wounded, some pretending. The shooting did not stay contained. At one of the guard towers, SS men attempting to surrender were shot as they climbed down. Elsewhere, prisoners, skeletal but fueled by adrenaline, seized guards with their bare hands. Some American soldiers intervened. Some did not. Sparks heard the gunfire and ran toward it. He saw his men firing into a cluster of bodies. He drew his pistol and fired into the air. "Stop!" He did not shout it once. He shouted it repeatedly. The machine gun fell silent. For a brief window, perhaps an hour, Dachau had ceased to function as a military operation. It had become something else. Not organized retaliation, not planned execution, but a rupture, a collapse of distance between witness and participant. Sparks moved quickly to restore order. He separated prisoners from captured guards. He posted armed men to protect surviving Germans, not from the enemy, but from his own soldiers. By afternoon, control had returned. But what had happened in that coalyard could not be undone, and it would not remain buried. News of the shootings did not disappear into the rubble of the camp. Photographs were taken that day. Statements were written. Within days, an inquiry was opened. The U.S. Army had rules. Even in victory, even at Dachau, an investigative team arrived to determine whether American troops had violated the laws of war. They interviewed officers. They examined photographs from the coalyard. They counted bodies. The findings were uncomfortable. Surrendered prisoners had been shot, some after they had been disarmed. Under military law, that mattered. Recommendations for court-martial were drafted. The report moved up the chain of command, and eventually it reached General George S. Patton. Patton was no sentimentalist. He enforced discipline ruthlessly. He relieved officers for minor failures. But he had also toured the camp. He had seen the train. He had walked through the crematorium buildings. When he read the investigative summary, he understood the legal implications. He also understood the human ones. In correspondence, Patton referred to the SS as the slime of the earth. He described his men as overwrought. The investigation stalled. Some sources suggest formal charges were considered and then quietly dropped. Others indicate the case was administratively closed without proceeding to trial. There is no record of a court-martial ever taking place over the Dachau shootings. Eisenhower, who had insisted on documenting the camps for history, did not publicly pursue prosecution either. The official war had rules, but April 29th had exposed their limits. And in the uneasy space between justice and revenge, the army chose silence. The war in Europe ended 8 days later. There were parades, there were photographs, there were headlines celebrating liberation. But for many of the men who entered Dachau, the victory felt different. They did not speak much about it, not to reporters, not to their families, not even to one another. Years later, some would describe the train before they described the shooting. The smell, the stillness, the eyes of the dead. A few acknowledged the coalyard. Most did not. Felix Sparks rarely discussed the reprisals in detail. When asked, he emphasized the restoration of order. Others admitted they had felt nothing when they pulled the trigger, and that frightened them more than the act itself. War prepares soldiers to kill in combat. It does not prepare them to witness industrialized starvation. The men of the 45th Division returned home to farms, to factories, to universities. They built lives. They raised children. They attended reunions, but Dachau followed them. In silence, in interrupted sleep. In the careful way some avoided war films. In the way others would say, simply, "You had to be there." History would debate what happened in that coalyard. The veterans rarely did. For them, the argument was not academic. It was personal. Today, Dachau is quiet. The barbed wire remains. The crematorium buildings stand preserved. The railway line still runs beside the memorial grounds. Visitors walk slowly. They read names. They stand in silence where thousands once waited in terror. There is no plaque marking the coalyard shooting. No monument listing the SS guards who died against that wall. The memorial honors the victims of the camp, as it should. History's sympathy lies with those who were imprisoned there. Among historians, the events of April 29th are described carefully. Some call them reprisals. Others call them summary executions. Most agree on two things. The killings were not ordered policy, and they were not prosecuted. They occurred in the immediate aftermath of liberation, in a space where law collided with horror. Neo-Nazis sometimes point to the incident as evidence of moral equivalence. Serious scholars reject that comparison. Dachau was a system of deliberate extermination. What happened in the coalyard was not. But neither was it simple. It remains one of the most uncomfortable moments of American military history, because it forces a question that has no clean answer. What happens when soldiers trained to uphold rules encounter something designed to destroy them? Can discipline survive absolute shock? On April 29, 1945, some men held the line, some lost it, and most carried the memory in silence. If you had stood beside that train, if you had opened those doors, would you have remained a soldier or become something else? History does not answer that for us. It only records that on that day, something changed, forever.